Hello, and thank you very much for joining me for this session, What is a Literature Review? My name is Dr. Sam Newton, and I'm an academic skills tutor at the Writing Centre, University of Liverpool. The agenda today includes not only what is a literature review, but some of the methodological framings of approaching a literature review and how a literature review can in fact form part of the synthesis and articulation of a final research project. Moreover, some of the skills I'll be talking about today will include postgraduate approaches to literature review, because of course this is a postgraduate level and we need to have the tools of the trade so that we can articulate, synthesize, and use appropriate methodological constructions in order to extract from the literature, presumably peer-reviewed literature, and extract from that medium and synthesize and articulate within the broader frameworks of our research. And these are some of the things I'd like to tackle today. So just very briefly, I'll just talk through the agenda. Skills. What skills are required? Now, if I say literature review, we may make assumptions that we just read material and just paraphrase and transport information from one page onto the written formula of our project or indeed of our assignments. No, it's more than that. We need to ask critical questions about the literature and see ways in which we can infuse core arguments, methodologies into the articulation of critical research. Okay, so the skills are more complex at postgraduate level, and it's those complexities that I'd like to talk about. In order to talk about the literature review, I think also it's important to see, well, what is a final research project, for example? If I'm performing this literature review, how does it fit into the broader scheme of my studies? But that section on final research project actually will be brief, but within the context of propelling onwards to consider what is a literature review. What is the purpose of a literature review? Why bother? Why can't we just write assignments that are based on subjective opinion? Why do we need to include a range of objectivity articulation that is formulated through broader reading? And so I'd just like to touch on the purpose of a literature review, not just what it is, but why do it in the first place. Furthermore, I'd like to consider types of literature reviews and the basic formulas of engagement and processes of analysis. What sort of questions can we ask the literature? What sort of questions should we ought to avoid asking the literature? Okay, so with that, obviously, there's some common pitfalls that I'll just like to touch on. Of course, all of these presentations of points here are just illustrative. This is a brief snapshot on how you may use this presentation as a start point of departure to your research. Now, I always like to include question and answers in a presentation. Now, obviously, when we get to that point, hopefully the presentation itself has answered a number of questions that you may have, or it may flag up more, but I'll talk about how you can raise some questions and get some answers at that point. So what are the skills required for a literature review? Well, the first thing, of course, we need to think about some of the questions that we're going to ask, the resources that we're going to look for. And so critical analysis and synthesis is where we need to ask the literature core questions. For example, what is the thesis statement? What are the methodological approaches of the literature I'm going to look at or I am looking at? What evidence has this scholarship used? What type of evidence am I using? Okay, and at postgraduate level, what we're really looking for are peer-reviewed articles, stroke books. We're looking at documentation. It could be governmental documentation, but in actual fact, literature that has a position within the formulated research of the discipline area on which you are engaging. In other words, we're not necessarily looking at, wiki, for example, although Wikipedia can be useful to our research at postgraduate level. We're really nurturing our way towards peer-reviewed synthesis and looking at material that essentially is core leadership within the field of study. But as I say, we need to ask core questions, and let me just repeat those. What is the thesis statement? What are the methodologies? What is the evidence? Take a look at the bibliography and referencing that's been extracted within that article, and consider the position of the scholarship that you're looking at within your field of study. And I'll talk about the latter in just a moment. So when we're resourcing information, obviously when we resource it, we have notions in our mind about the particulars of what we're looking for. We've got particular questions that we may be asking that literature. So we've got to make sure that when we go to the resource, whether it's the library, looking at the journals particular to our field of study and such like, in actual fact, we resource information that is particular, precise, and has an authoritative voice within our field of study. Okay, so be very sure that that's where we're navigating ourselves to. I don't know about you, I can be easily distracted with all the various links and hyperlinks that sometimes are attached to this a whole void of information. But in order to be, I suppose, time effective, look at the core voices within your field of study, because those core voices essentially are engaged in an academic dialogue with each other and perhaps responding to some of the points. So going back to what I was saying about critical analysis and synthesis, I mentioned the point about, well, what is the position of what we're reading within the field of study? Is it groundbreaking? Is it providing a response to, say, a formula or a methodology or a particular concept that has been referred to someone else previously? Or in actual fact, is what we're reading coming in and, if you like, providing some groundbreaking method or concept for us to consider? What is the dialogue? The academic dialogue can also be a critique of someone else's concept or methodological approach, or it could be the academic dialogue and response could be one concept and divergent approaches by different scholarship. And so when we're reading actual fact, first of all, we've got to resource the appropriate material, but when we're reading the material, we've got to think of a number of levels. What is the article saying for itself, and how does it fit into the academic dialogue? But the other aspect, and of course these are all intertwined, although there's an arrow on screen there, these are intertwined, interconnected. You will oscillate between critical analysis and considering what the academic dialogue are. These aren't incremental steps, other than firstly, of course, we've got to resource the information in order to have this articulation. But part of the literature review is actually thinking about, okay, what is the scholarship saying? What sort of dialogue is being had? But also, how is the literature articulating itself? How is it corresponding and responding to the development of ideas? Okay, because when it comes to writing your literature review and your final project, it is a culmination of that articulation and development of ideas, which you are, if you synthesizing within your critical response. But briefly, I'm going to just step out of the literature review for just a moment, because I've used the terminology final research project. Now, through the form of your final research project and its required elements will depend, of course, on your program. But in general, there are some core elements to your final project. Obviously, a title, an abstract that gives an overview of intention, your chapters that may be broken down into sort of introduction, main chapters, conclusion, bibliography, stroke referencing, and appendix. Now, within the synthesis, within the formula of your research project, within that you will be expected, for most programs anyway, to perform a literature review. So a literature review may be experimented by itself in an isolated assessment, but culminates into a broader presence within the final research project. And I just wanted to touch the relevance of a research review and the position of it within your studies. But let's go back a few steps here, okay? I've said about resourcing. I've mentioned about, the sorts of things we can ask the database that we're looking at in terms of readership perspective. But what exactly is a literature review? At postgraduate level, a literature review is an investigation of published works directly related to your topic area. And as mentioned previously, that's can be peer reviewed, it can be authoritative voice within your field of study, whether that's government papers and such like. Continuing then, it proves a critical analysis of main contributors to your research area and helps situate your research in the ongoing conversation about the topic. So in other words, your literature review, your synthesis and broader reading is part of a broader framework of your response to particulars or particular concepts, methodologies within your field of study. It's part of a broader picture. Therefore, to continue, the form of your literature review may vary depending on your program of study. And this is the emphasis here, that obviously a literature review and its situation within your broader studies will be dependent on your area of study. So that's the thing we need to be clear on. Okay. So what is the purpose of a literature review? Well, the instinct here is to say the purpose allows a learned academic approach to the concepts in the field of study which you're engaging in at postgraduate level. Broader reading, when I say broader reading, I don't mean just reading one peer-reviewed article. It will involve actually a literature review will involve reading a spectrum of material. Okay, that may be divergent from different genres, different discipline areas that you will use in order to articulate within your research. Cooper in 1988 outlined 6 characteristics of the literature review. Now, this could help you think about what information is needed or could be included within your literature review as stated here on screen. And so those 6 core areas is focus, goal, perspective, coverage, organisation and audience. And what you see in table 1 there is an outline what those core concept areas or core characteristic areas of the literature according to Cooper are. So focus includes research outcomes, research methods, theories, practices or applications. For Cooper, goal includes integration, and the subsections of that are generalization, conflict resolution, linguistic bridge building. Further categories include criticism, identification of central issues. A third characteristic includes 2 categories according to Cooper, neutral representation and espousal of position. Fourth characteristic includes coverage, and those categories involve exhaustive with selective citation, representative, central or pivotal. A fifth characteristic, organisation, includes the categories of historical, conceptual, methodological. And finally, the 6th characteristic, audience, includes specialised scholars, general scholars, practitioners or policymakers, and general public. So hopefully this table in actual fact has encapsulated some of the thoughts I've been talking about in the previous slides. Okay, thinking about the focus there, the methodological processes or methods, and looking at outcomes of research. Obviously, we need to be objective in the way in which we extract from the literature in order to provide an objective framework within our research. Okay. But the other element is to look at the historical range within the scholarship as well as the conceptual. And I do think that is something that I would like to emphasize at this point, of which Cooper is highlighting for us. But in terms of literature review, approaches may vary. So what are the steps? Let's take a step back just for a moment and think, right, okay, the steps are, okay, what am I researching? And okay, I've got my research framework articulated. What are the resources I need to use in order to develop and articulate that research area? So I need to go and find resources. What type of resources ought I be looking for? And as Cooper's just highlighted, peer-reviewed material, academic material, governmental material, and such like. Okay. What sort of questions can I ask that material as I'm reading through it? And I've suggested, what is the thesis statement? What are the methods? What is the position of the material within the field of study? Those sorts of things. So from that reading, I've taken or extracted notes, and those notes can include theoretical points, or you may find it useful as you're doing your literature review to have an annotated bibliography on the go, so where you put the title, the reference title of the material that you're reading, and underneath that a paragraph or so talking about the core points within that reading. It's not very long, just a paragraph of annotated bibliography. You may at that point of reading, of course, think about, okay, what do you consider to be core quotations or citations, or look at the holistic picture in terms of argumentation. So those notes there are something that you're going to draw upon when it comes to the point of writing your literature review. And as we've seen, a literature review is an articulation of the literature and how it critically fits into your field of study. So it's come to the point now of where, right, I'm going to write up my literature review, and there are various approaches that may be engaged. It could be a comparative approach. A comparative approach provides a qualitative summary of the existing research on the given topic area. It uses informal methods to evaluate methodology and the validity of the findings. It identifies potential gaps in the research and situates the student's own research in the wider conversation of that topic. But a comparative approach also includes, if you like, looking at, say, scholarship A, scholarship B, maybe C, and the position of your own scholarship, your own position within the field of study in a comparative way. X says this, but Y says that, but in agreement to B, for example. So there are ways in which the comparative approach enables us to open up some of the dialogue discourse that has been happening within that scholarship, within that field of study. A systematic approach is another approach to a literature review, and this includes an in-depth review defined as, and this is Cochrane Collaboration 2014, open quotation, a review of a clearly formulated question that uses systematic and explicit methods to identify, select, and critically appraise relevant research, and to collect and analyse data from the studies that are included in the review. Statistical methods, meta-analysis, may or may not be used to analyse and summarise the results of the included studies. Close citation. Now, here in terms of something to keep in mind or a top tip, a comparative literature reviews are more common than systematic ones. but you as a student with their advisor may decide that a systematic one is more appropriate for your given topic. And so be mindful of the different approaches of a literature review, and here are just examples of two. There are other approaches to a literature review that you may want to talk through with your advisor. So the basic formula then, this is almost like a roundup. What is the basic formula for a literature review? Well, first of all, identify the main concerns of the reviewed scholarship, consider points of agreement and departure, essentially compare and contrast. And finally, what is the relevance to your own original contribution and methodological outcomes? Remember, it's your voice that has been objectively articulated within the synthesis of your research findings of that scholarship. Just to round off then, what are the processes of analysis? Well, critically review relevant sources. Critical review on one hand, but relevant sources are crucial on the other. Consider methodological approaches, and there is another presentation talking about methods and methodological approaches and theories, which you may want to just kind of touch on as part of the base actually of approaching your literature review. Compare and contrast theoretical and methodological applications, identify leaders of the field of study, identify respondents from current contributors to the field of study, consider gaps in the field of study too, and evaluate revisionist approaches and spectrum. So essentially what I'm doing here is giving a synopsis of the approaches I referred to earlier on in the presentation. Here they are. So finally, what I would like to say, well, okay, I've given you the approaches, and hopefully you feel very encouraged and ready now to take on a literature review. But before we do go, I just would like to highlight some of the excellent common pitfalls highlighted by Goldborg and Gull. And here are some of the common issues that may occur as a researcher. Firstly, doesn't clearly relate the findings of the literature review to the researcher's own study. And this is something I alluded to a moment ago, where I can, as a researcher, sometimes be distracted by things that are interesting me, and I'm really enjoying something I read, and I'm trying to find a way in which to squeeze it into or shoehorn it into my research. But in my heart of hearts, I know it's not relevant, and so you will find yourself as you're doing your research. You may find yourself reading material that may interest you. You're not sure whether it's relevant or not, but when it actually comes to the crunch of writing your literature review and your final project there, you may think, actually, this isn't relevant. I'm going to have to let this go. And so be sure that what you are including within your writing is actually relevant to your field of study and to what you are researching. A second pitfall potentially could be doesn't sufficiently identify the best sources to review related to the research own topic. And again, this comes down to, in some discipline areas, it's required that you extract reviews from a particular time spectrum. So if you include materials beyond that, perhaps you're not quite looking at the core requirements specific to your field of study. So just be mindful of that too. Thirdly, relies on secondary sources rather than primary sources in reviewing the literature. Now, of course, literature will utilize various forms of evidence, and obviously here think about the evidence that's been used, the test cases and such like. And again, a further presentation on methodologies and theories may just help us a little bit more thinking about ways in which evidence is used and approaches are used in order to articulate that evidence within the scholarship material. A fourth pitfall could be an uncritical or uncritically accepts another researcher's findings and interpretations as valid, rather than examining critically all aspects of the research design and analysis. Again, this is crucial. Sometimes we can be influenced by the articulation, the language, and the presentation or medium of an article. But in actual fact, if we ask crucial questions about it, what is the thesis statement? What is the methodology? What evidence has been used? How's that evidence been articulated? What is the relevance of this material within the field of study? By asking those core questions that I referred to on the previous slide, we may find ourselves actually, whilst this article is nicely written, it's not necessarily critical research. And again, we may be thinking to ourselves of the relevance of the inclusion of that within our own research. Fifth, doesn't report the search procedures used in a literature review, and this is really crucial as well. Any literature that is informing your literature review, please do take with huge diligence the reference noting as well, because this is absolutely crucial. Doesn't, and this is the sixth point, doesn't consider contrary findings and alternative interpretations in synthesizing quantitative, literature. And so here, once again, is what I was saying previously, take a look at divergent material, put it in the pot there, and mix it around and see what the various findings are, compare and contrast approach, and as I say, ask core questions for those approaches as well. So that leads me to say, well, although this session is a recording, I'm open to questions. So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate either to take a look at the platform, the Centre for Student Success, or come and drop me a note at the Writing Centre. So if there's anything else that I can assist you with, or any other academic skills tutor from the Writing Centre can assist you with, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you for your time.